In this video, I'm going to be discussing the belt-fed autoloader versus the 1-meter autoloader. The main difference between the belt-fed and the normal autoloader is that the belt-fed autoloader reloads much faster than a regular autoloader, but you can't fire while it's reloading. Also, you can't put ammo ejectors onto belt-fed autoloaders either. The belt-fed also costs $600, which is more than twice as much as the normal one, which costs $240. Is this really worth the extra cost? Which one is better if you're trying to build a gun using 1-meter long shells? Now I have a small setup here. Both of these guns are the same volume. The first gun's built using normal autoloaders, and the second one's built using belt-fed autoloaders. Now let's compare their stats. This is the normal autoloader. They both have a volume of 16. The normal autoloader has 1.49 firepower with 896 materials per firepower and 10.71 volume per firepower. If you compare it to the belt-fed autoloader gun, you can see there's some differences in firepower and efficiencies. Keep in mind that this firepower and the materials per firepower stats, they're not really accurate because it doesn't take into account the sustained firepower and the downtime from reloading. I recalculated the mats and the volume efficiency using the sustained firepower, which you can see by hovering over the gun, of 1.94. If we compare the two guns, the belt-fed one is more efficient than the normal one. Keep in mind that this is only for the small guns that I built here. The efficiencies will change on larger guns because of tetrising, but it shows that the belt-fed can be competitive with the normal autoloader. The APS shell that I'll be putting into all these guns will be this generic Sabo Fin sandblaster shell, just to keep things simple in our comparisons. If you hover over the ammo intake of the regular autoloader, you can see it has a loading time of 7.2 seconds. Compared to the belt-fed, which has a reload time of 1.4 seconds per shell. So the reload time is reduced by about 80%, and that's one of the big differences with the belt-fed as opposed to the normal autoloader. And that can make these belt-fed autoloaders really dense in firepower as opposed to the normal ones. Now you can't talk about belt-fed autoloaders without mentioning the uptime of the gun. So this is a series of different belt-fed Tetrises. This one is the one everyone is the most familiar with. It has a single belt-fed autoloader, a clip on top, and an ammo intake on top of the clip. This kind of Tetris has an uptime of 50%, which means that half the time the gun will be shooting, but the other half of the time it'll be reloading. Now you can increase the uptime by adding more ammo intakes into your Tetris. This one has one intake and a 50% uptime. This one I added a second ammo intake, and I get a 67.2% uptime. So we've increased it by 17.2%. This one is with 3 intakes, 75%, 4 intake is 81%, 5 is 84%, 6 is 87%, and then if for some reason you're building a gun with 7 intakes, which is the max that you can fit, then you can get an uptime of 89.2%. There's diminishing returns on uptime the more intakes that you add to your Tetris. This first one here, you get a 17% increase. The next one is only 8.7, and then 5.3, and then the last one only increases your uptime by 1.9. At some point, adding more intakes isn't worth it because you get very little increases in uptime, but it makes your Tetris worse. What I have here is a series of APS guns that I've built to showcase the differences between the belt-fed and the regular autoloaders, as well as different tetrising that you can do for them. I built all the guns to be 3 blocks high with the minimum amount of coolers needed to get the maximum RPM. I also optimized all of them to the best of my abilities. I built all the guns without using recoil absorbers because they're all using the same sandblaster shell, which doesn't really need recoil absorption. I want to keep things as simple as possible for this video. The first 3 guns here are using the regular autoloader, and these last 4 are using the belt-fed. I also built them using different tetrising. So this is the first gun. This is built using what's known as the 5-clip Tetris. This first one here is known as the 5-clip Tetris. If you look from above, it forms kind of like a cross, and it's called the 5-clip Tetris because you have 5 ammo clips connected to a single autoloader. And it has a column of coolers in the back to connect to the rest of the gun. I used the APS Optimizer program to help me build the Tetris for these guns. Alright, this is kind of the pattern I used for this gun. There's 6 of these Tetrises put together, and that forms this gun. And if we look at the stats, one thing I want to point out is this has the best materials per firepower out of all these other guns. The volume per firepower is a little bit low though, so keep that in mind. So one disadvantage of this Tetris is that it can be a little bit difficult to do, and it's not as intuitive as the others. But you can use the APS Optimizer program to generate the Tetrising pattern for you, and that really saves you a lot of time. This is the second gun, and the Tetris for it is a little bit different than the first one. The first Tetris forms a cross or a plus sign, and the second one forms a T shape. This one has 4 clips attached to it, as opposed to the first Tetris, which has 5 clips attached. And once again, I just used the Optimizer program to generate the Tetris for this one. One thing to keep in mind going forward is that this T-shaped arrangement of blocks is really ideal for Tetrising. And this program is really good at generating efficient T-shaped Tetrises. And if we look at the stats, the materials per firepower is slightly worse, but not by a lot. Now this gun here, it's almost identical to the gun on the left, except at the bottom we removed a clip and replaced it with an ammo ejector. And predictably, the stats are going to be a little bit worse. The materials per firepower is worse, the volume per firepower is significantly worse. But the one advantage for using ejectors with your 1-clip is that if you're using chemical shells, they won't chain react. However, if you're just using this sandblaster kinetic shell, the explosion from these clips being destroyed is actually not strong enough to cause a chain reaction. And I'll show you that now. I can start damaging these clips, and as you can see, there's no chain reaction at all. And all these other guns, even though it looks really scary with the explosion, it's not chain reacting at all. And the same thing with all these other guns. Only the part that gets destroyed will get destroyed. Everything else takes a minuscule amount of damage instead of blowing up. Now I've gone and replaced these kinetic sandblaster shells with this chemical shell to show you what happens when you don't have ejectors on your chemical shells. So they can chain react and completely take out the entire turret if you aren't using ejectors and defuses on the shells. Alright, this one uses ejectors, so nothing's going to happen. So that's the advantage of using this particular Tetris with the ejector. Keep in mind that for kinetic shells like the sandblaster shells here, at 1 meter shell length, the clips blowing up don't do enough damage to chain react, so the ejectors are not really needed. Now, if you're using chemical shells, you should strongly consider the use of ejectors. Alright, continuing on, now we get into the belt-fed autoloader section. And this one here is the Tetris that most of you are probably familiar with. So you have a belt-fed on the bottom with a clip on top, and then the ammo intake goes above it. This is probably the most common way I've seen these built. If you look at the stats, the materials per firepower is way worse than those guns earlier. However, you do get pretty decent volume per firepower. Another thing is, this has the highest burst firepower out of all of these other guns, but I don't think that's as valuable as it sounds. All the stats for these belt-fed guns I calculated using the sustained fire rate. As for the Tetris, I just kept it simple and stacked them next to each other like this, and then added just enough coolers so that I can reach my RPM. Now the second gun here was made using 2 intakes per belt fed. Now with this gun is where things start getting interesting. So your materials per firepower is way better than that last gun, but it's worse than the first 3 guns using the normal autoloaders. This gun, however, has the best volume per firepower out of all the guns. The Tetris is done with the belt-fed autoloader on the bottom with a clip on top and then 2 intakes next to the autoloader. Now you don't need your intakes to be on the bottom attached to the autoloader. You can actually do it like this and attach them to the clip on top. The important part is that it creates this T shape so that you can Tetris it efficiently. And for this gun, I just reused the Tetris that I got from the APS optimizer. Now I'll quickly show you how I built the Tetris. I'll grab a prefab of the Tetris. Then I just copy the pattern that I got from the APS optimizer. So I'll lay it down like this. And notice how I'm trying to follow the T-shapes in the optimizer. Alright, and then I'll just stack a second layer on top. Since you can connect your autoloaders next to each other and then they will connect to cooling vents. Now I'm just connecting them to coolers. And now here's my firing piece. Okay, I need to add way more coolers. I'm not at my limit of 681 RPM yet. Alright, I'm out of space. I'm going to remove one autoloader because I can't sustain that fire rate with the amount of coolers I have. Okay, there we go. That's how you build this Tetris. Now this is the 4 intake belt fed. Now this is the one that I think is the best out of all of these other guns overall. The way the Tetris is done is I have a belt fed and a clip and 4 ammo intakes on top and bottom, and it forms this rectangle shape from above. Here's how I did the Tetrising for this gun. I'm going to prefab the Tetris. I place these on the edge, kind of like this. And then I just tried my best to fill it in. Like right here, I would connect it like this so that these 2 intakes would then connect to a cooling piece. And then just repeat. There's probably a better way to do this, but this is just for demonstration purposes. And now I'll place the coolers. Now I need a few more coolers to reach my autoloader limit. There we go, and that's how this Tetris is done. Now, this is a little bit strange. It's different from any other Tetris that you've probably done, but it's actually really simple once you start doing it. Now, unfortunately, you can't use the APS optimizer to generate the Tetris for these, but I think it's simple enough that anyone can do this with a little bit of practice. So if we look at the stats, it has 556 materials per firepower, which is actually really good. And it has a very good volume per firepower of 4.69. So by comparison, this one has the best volume per firepower of 4.46, and this one is close behind. And then if we look at the normal autoloaders, this one has 536 materials per firepower. This one has 550. And then this one has 556. So you're almost material efficient as the regular autoloader. However, you have way better volume per firepower than those. So you can fit a way stronger gun into the same space. I think this one is the best out of all of them if you're willing to put up with the 19% downtime whenever this thing has to reload, which honestly isn't even that bad. Now this final gun, I kind of built it to experiment and try and get the highest uptime as possible. It uses this awful Tetris to cram as many ammo intakes as possible into each autoloader to try and reduce the downtime as much as possible. This gun has an uptime of 87.3%, but the Tetris is just so awful to work with that I just couldn't figure out a efficient way to place things, and this is the best I can come up with. And the stats aren't even that good to make up for it. So your volume per firepower is terrible, and your materials per firepower, although it's not bad, you're not really gaining anything. Like, you can just do this gun and have better materials per firepower and better volume per firepower. So I don't recommend you try and maximize uptime. If you don't want to deal with the downtime of reloading, just use the regular autoloaders over there. They have 100% uptime. Now I'm going to fire these 4 belt-fed guns just so you can see what the uptime and downtime is like. Now I sped this part up here so you're not waiting around while they run out of ammo. It took all the guns 60 seconds to run out of ammo. This part here I left it at regular speed so you can see how quickly each gun comes back. I sped this part up again because it takes the first gun a full minute before it reloads. So I'm going to put a table with the stats of all these guns on the screen while I highlight some important takeaways. For regular autoloaders, if you're just using kinetic shells like these sandblaster shells, then you don't really need the ejectors because they don't chain react enough to blow up the whole gun. So either stick with the 3-clip without the ammo ejector, or you're really trying to maximize your materials per firepower, then try the 5-clip Tetris. And of course, use the APS optimizer to generate the best Tetris for your particular turret. For 2 meters or longer autoloaders, I highly recommend you use ejectors on them, however. For your belt-fed autoloaders, I recommend you try the 4-intake belt-fed with this kind of rectangular Tetrising. It's going to take a little bit of getting used to, but I think it's worth it because you have pretty good uptime of 81%, and you have good materials per firepower and good volume per firepower as well. If you're trying to maximize volume per firepower, then I actually recommend you use the 2-intake Tetris. So you take either one of these to make a T-shape, and then you can use your APS optimizer to generate the Tetris pattern and then build it so that you get the best firepower per volume. And for the 1 intake and the 6 intake autoloaders, I just recommend you never use these. The 1 intake belt fed has really bad materials per firepower, although the Tetris, I will admit, is pretty easy to do. It just has really bad stats in comparison. Like, your materials per firepower is bad, and your volume per firepower, although it's decent, it's not as good as these other guns. And to top it off, the 50% uptime is really, really painful. As you saw earlier, this gun, when it ran out of ammo, took an eternity to start shooting again. And then for the 6 intake, just ignore this. This is a meme, never do it. If you're trying to get 100% uptime, just do the regular autoloader. I hope you found this video useful for building your next APS gun. Leave a comment if you have any questions or suggestions for my next video.